Hello and welcome to Future Squared. Stephen Hawking once said that intelligence is the ability to adapt to change, so let's adapt. My name is Steve Glaveski, and each week I'll bring you conversations with preeminent thought leaders from a variety of fields to help you think in a multidisciplinary way, keep goals in your professional and personal life, and better navigate what is fast becoming a brave new world. Future Squared is brought to you by Collective Campus, an innovation accelerator that works with organizations to unlock their people's latent potential to create more impact for humanity and lead more fulfilling lives. If you need help driving your organization's innovation strategy, visit collectivecampus.io. And without further ado,
come with me if you want to live.
You know, it's okay to stomach losses or struggles or failures in the context of learning. But if it's not in the context of learning, I often say failures of effort, meaning failing because think about lifting a heavy weight and you've lifted such a heavy weight that you can no longer lift it. You've lifted to failure. Those are failures that come from effort. And that's great, right? Those are the failures that allow your muscles to grow. But if you fail for lack of effort, that is terrible because those are the ones that don't stimulate your muscles to grow.
welcome back to Future Squared for episode number 294 with Peter Bregman. Bregman has worked with CEOs and senior leaders to help them create accountability and inspire collective action on their most important work. He helps leaders to develop their leadership skills, build aligned, collaborative teams, and overcome obstacles to drive results for their organizations. Bregman is the author, most recently, of Leading with Emotional Courage, How to Have Hard Conversations, Create Accountability, and Inspire Action on Your Most Important Work. His book, 18 Minutes, Find Your Focus, Master Distraction, and Get the Right Things Done, was a Wall Street Journal bestseller. And his previous effort, 4 seconds, all the time you need to replace counterproductive habits with ones that really work, was a New York Post top pick for your career in 2015. Bregman is a sought-after speaker and a thought leader in the areas of leadership development, organizational change, productivity, and emotional courage. He's the host of the Bregman Leadership Podcast, which offers insightful conversations with industry thought leaders on how to become more powerful, courageous leaders. He is also a regular contributor to the Harvard Business Review, and his articles and commentary appear frequently in Bloomberg BusinessWeek, Fast Company, Psychology Today, Forbes, the Financial Times, PBS, ABC, CNN, NPR, and Fox Business News. We unpacked many topics on leadership from his book, including 1, how to have hard conversations, 2, why being a leader doesn't mean having all the answers, and 3, how to focus on the most important things. This just scratches the surface of what we explored. Due to some initial technical difficulties, the introductory banter I normally engage in with my guests was unfortunately lost, so we picked this conversation up at my very first question, which was around people getting into leadership positions purely based on technical prowess, without having thought too much about how to truly motivate people, take ownership in times of crisis, embrace difficult conversations, or develop the requisite emotional intelligence required to lead effectively. With that, here's Peter Bregman with his thoughts.
So it's a great question and a useful observation, Steve. Here's the thing. When you think about it, by the time people have gotten to senior leadership roles, they have already been schooled in all the technical aspects of their job. They know everything they need to know for the most part about marketing and the technology of their business and the business of their business. Mm-hmm. Those are their strong points. They wouldn't have gotten to that place had they not, been successful in those arenas. But the leadership element, that's new to them oftentimes. And that they don't have the same kind of skill and expertise in creating inspiration underneath them, in developing the kind of loyalty and accountability that gets people thinking on their own to develop new solutions, in speaking in a way that kind of compels the best out of the people around them, or making hard decisions when there's conflict. Those tend to be somewhat new new challenges for leaders. And for the most part, they haven't been schooled in those. They've sort of picked it up along the way as they've been in various leadership roles that they've been in. But the challenges are bigger and new, and those are the things that people need the most support with.
Yeah, and as somebody climbs the ranks and progresses from being in a purely technical role, be it in, say, marketing, to a leadership role, then, I mean, they're obviously doing a lot less of the hands-on doing work, and they need to be doing the leading. And I know from my almost a decade in the corporate world with companies like EY and KPMG, it seemed to me like a lot of people that were climbing the ranks, whenever there was some form of, say, soft skills training or emotional intelligence workshops and things of that sort, there was a tendency to undervalue that type of training or those types of soft skills. I mean, what are your views on that?
I love the fact that you say soft skills, because it helps me say that I think it's the opposite,
okay.
Right? That when you actually look at why people succeed or fail, it's based on those skills. Meaning a leader, I have never seen a leader fail at a senior level because they didn't know enough about what people call the hard skills, right? That's not why people, anybody listening to us, think about why leaders fail. Is it because they didn't know those quote unquote hard skills? Or is it because they were not skilled at what people call the soft skills, which I really think are the hard skills of leadership, right? Which is, the ability to navigate difficult political situations, the ability to communicate at times of tension and conflict in a way that inspires people to go along with them. I mean, the willingness and ability to, again, make hard decisions that not everybody will be happy with, but you need everybody to get behind. I mean, that's leadership, and that's the really hard stuff that, and that people need hard skills in following through on.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look at leaders such as, say, Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, I mean, they're not out there in the trenches, building Amazon Web Services infrastructure, for example, but they are selling the vision and they are inspiring their people to great feats. And that's why such companies such as Amazon and Tesla have been able for so long to record, say, loss after loss after loss, yet their share price reflects something very different, which is constant growth.
Yeah, what it speaks to, and we could, it could be interesting to have this conversation about Elon Musk versus Jeff Bezos, because I think they are two very different kinds of leaders. But both of them certainly recognize the need to lead, above the details. But I bet they still understand the details. It's just they're not doing it. It's one of the hardest things for people when they move from individual contributor positions to management or leadership positions, which is you have to let go of control of the minutia and the details, and you have to trust the people underneath you. And one of your big jobs as a leader is to make sure you've got the right team around you who is trustworthy, right? Who can actually make things happen. And then your job is to let go of the, kind of let go so that you're not constantly involved in details that really belong on other people's plates.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you brought up the contributor versus the leadership and management role, because it's something that I discussed with Rand Fishkin, the founder of Moz, on this show a few months back. And there's certain types of technical people who say they're web developers or UI designers or things of that sort, who perhaps love what they do. But in order for them to climb the ranks and be rewarded financially, they need to move into those leadership roles, which incidentally is not something that they actually love or something that they naturally gravitate towards. I mean, what's your view on organizations pushing people, say creative people, into roles that they don't necessarily want to do, but have to do in order to climb the ranks and be remunerated accordingly for their efforts?
I mean, the short answer is I'm against it. So what I've actually designed, I did this for a number of different companies, designed career path programs that avoid that problem completely, right? Which is to say, if you need for the success of an individual for them to start to manage, you will by definition end up with a number of managers who are mediocre at best and uninterested in getting better, because that's not what their strength is. So what you need is a career path for individual contributors to still contribute their genius without having to manage people. Managing people is a very particular kind of task, and not everybody's interested in it. Everybody could get good at it. That's not a problem. You can get good at it. But a lot of people just simply aren't interested in it. And, you know, if you're not interested in being a really good manager, you won't be a good manager. And to be a good manager, you have to care more about the development of people than you do about the particular outcome that you're going for. You have to trust that if you develop the people around you really effectively, that they will then get to the outcomes that you need to get to. And you have to allow for them to make some mistakes on their way. Otherwise, they'll never get there. So that's not easy. But that's what great managers do. And that's very different than individual contributors that might be more interested in the outcome than anything else.
Yeah, and that's a fantastic point there about developing the people and trusting that they will have the ability to deliver on the desired outcomes. And it's something that a lot of great leaders, whether it's Richard Branson in the business domain or Stanley McChrystal in the military domain, they talk about empowering the troops to go out and deliver on the mission. Like, you give them the mission, you give them what they need to succeed, and you ultimately hire great people and get the hell out of the way. And I know Stanley McChrystal used to talk about this during his time in the Middle East, heading up a unit over there, whereby initially there'd be the top-down hierarchical command coming from Washington. And by the time the orders got down to the field, it was too late. It was too slow. But by changing tact and empowering people on the ground to make decisions, leave the details up to them, so long as it aligns with the mission, then you have this much faster feedback loop. And in today's environment where the world is moving so quickly, you can't afford to have a slow feedback loop.
Right. 100%. I'm 100%. Those are the people who are closest to the action. Those are the people that really know a tremendous amount. And those are the people, by the way, whose opinions you want to hear and they want to have heard if they're going to be engaged. But if you don't go to them, if your communication is one way, if you don't think that they really have value to add, then, you know, by definition, they're going to be disengaged. And it's and you end up losing huge wealth of information and power of the organization lies in these lower or more junior levels of an organization that often aren't consulted. And as leaders, you know, again, that goes back to the trust. Like, as leaders, we need to trust them enough and be curious enough about what they're seeing to really draw out their knowledge and awareness and insight that can help us run the organization. So that's another thing, which is that if before you're a leader, when you're an individual contributor, you're used to having the answers. And in fact, you're valued for having the answers, and you better have the answers. As a senior leader, you actually really need to not have the answers, right? If you have all the answers, then, you know, you're not leaving room for other people to share their insights. And since you're not as close anymore to what's going on, chances are your answers, you know, need to be informed by the answers of other people. So you have to become comfortable with not knowing. And that's hard.
Yeah. And I mean, innovation, problem solving, creativity often happens at the intersection of different ideas, different people, different industries, different technologies. And if you put yourself forward as someone that has all of the answers, you might have an answer, but it's probably not going to be the very best one.
Absolutely. Like you need, actually, in fact, this is a good way of thinking about it. As leaders, you need to be really, really good at asking questions and drawing out answers from the people around you. If you're the smartest person in the room and have all the answers ready-made, why do you need people? And if the only reason you need people is to execute on exactly what you're saying, you will end up losing your best people and keeping your mediocre ones. So you need to find people who are smarter individual contributors than you ever were. And you have to devote your energy to being the great leaders they want to work for. And just think about when you were an individual contributor, the kind of leader you wanted to work for.
Yeah.
Right? And that's different than the kind of person you wanted to be. You wanted to be the star. You wanted to work hard. You wanted to come up with creative, innovative solutions. You wanted, to work with others and to collaborate, to do things no one had ever dreamed of before.
Mm-hmm.
As the leader, it's not your job to do that anymore. It's your job to create an environment in which other people can do that. And that means you have to check your ego at the door and actually support the ego of the people around you who are going to be coming up with their great solutions.
So on not having the answer all the time, I mean, obviously for a lot of people listening to this show who maybe they've been in the corporate world for a couple of decades, I mean, that's a bit of a departure from what we've learned growing up and what we've perhaps learned in the corporate world. Once you get to that position of leadership, of authority, you're expected to be infallible. You're expected to have all the answers. But I guess the modern literature on the topic suggests that by not having the answers, but by showing you've thought through a number of different variables that may contribute to the answer, and also by showing a little bit of vulnerability, you can come across a lot more confident than what you would be if you just said, this is the answer, I know this just because. And also by showing some vulnerability, you become a lot more relatable to the people below you in an organization.
Exactly. Nobody is interested in working with someone or working for someone who has all the answers. But it's counterintuitive because when you're in the leadership role, when you're in the senior-most role in an organization, you feel like you should have all the answers. And this is, in my book, Leading with Emotional Courage, I talk about this a lot because it takes tremendous amount of emotional courage, a willingness to feel, right? It takes a tremendous amount of emotional courage to not know something. It takes much more emotional courage to not know something than it does to know something. And, think of, and by the way, emotional courage is the gap that most leaders end up facing, which is it's not the courage to act, but it's the courage to feel, which underlies the courage to act. That's the really hard part.
Yeah. And I know in your book, you basically say that it's about whether you're willing to feel, to experience the discomfort, the risk, the uncertainty. And that is effectively what you call having emotional courage. And one great one-liner that came out of your book that I totally resonate with is, if you are willing to feel everything, you can do anything. And I think it's just so powerful, not just only in the leadership domain, but in our experience of life. Just recently, I got up at 5 a.m. to meet a client of mine while I was in Sydney for a 6 a.m. surf. And it was a cold winter morning here in Sydney. There was all sorts of anxiety leading up to it. I was sleep deprived in the morning because I couldn't sleep that night just thinking about it because I am not a surfer. But after the actual event, I was on cloud nine, feeling the cold water at 6 a.m, catching a couple of waves, and then just floating on cloud nine for the rest of the day. But that would not have been possible if I was not willing to face the discomfort, not only to learn, but to also grow and just push myself beyond that comfort zone. But if a leader isn't willing to feel that discomfort, then they're only going to have a very limited influence on the organization, I would imagine.
That's true. So let's do a little thought experiment so that people can really understand what this looks like. Imagine for a moment, or think for a moment about a difficult conversation that you're not having, right? A conversation that you haven't had, but that you need to have, right? You know that you should have, but you procrastinated on. So think about, do you have one in mind that you can think of that's specific, and all the listeners should do the same thing?
Well, it could be that you have an employee who is underperforming.
Yeah. And so it could be personal, right? It could be anything that you could think of that is, where that you procrastinated on. Now imagine and think for a second, what's stopping you? Why you procrastinated? Like, what is it that you are not, like why have you not followed through? And imagine this, or I'm willing to bet. 1, you know everything you need to know to have that conversation. 2, you have the skills you need to have that conversation. 3, you've had enough time to have the conversation. And 4 is you've had opportunity to have the conversation. So if all of those things are true, then why haven't you had it? And the answer is because there's something you don't want to feel. That if you have that conversation, then you might have to feel their anger, or you might have to feel their defensiveness, or they might come back at you, and you might have to feel your own defensiveness, and you might have to feel shame or embarrassment, or you might have to feel the passive aggressive behavior that comes after you've had the hard conversation, or any number of things. And because you don't want to feel the discomfort of all of those things, you don't follow through and have the conversation. And if you are willing to feel all of it, if you're willing to feel insecurity and shame and embarrassment and anger and frustration and passive aggressiveness, if you're willing to feel everything, then you can do anything. And that's the underlying idea of emotional courage.
Yeah, and that's very, very well said and articulated. And I guess that aligns with one of the 4 C's you've identified in your book. You said that great leaders exhibit 4 personality traits: confident in themselves, connected to others, committed to success, and emotionally courageous. And when you talk about connected to others, I mean, that's about being direct with people, not procrastinating on difficult conversations, as we've just unpacked. How does that align with some of the narrative in management literature today around, say, radical transparency and radical candor that was made, packaged up by authors such as Ray Dalio and Kim Scott?
I think that radical transparency is great as long as it's done in relation to other people and with care. So I think there's ways in which people use the permission of transparency to be sloppy and hurtful.
Yeah.
And in those ways, I don't think it's useful. I don't think people are machines. And I think, understanding their emotions can help you to be more effective with them. I think transparency is really important. I think it's important to say what you mean and to be articulate and to share direct feedback and all of that. I think that's really, really important and really useful. I don't think you should just tell people what they want to hear. I don't think you should hide the truth. On the other hand, I think if you're going to go that route, which I think is a good idea, it's like an obligation to be skilled at it, right? To do it in a way where you're not doing it for your needs, you're doing it for their needs. A lot of time, someone will say, well, you're a jerk and I'm just being transparent, right? Or you just don't know how to do your job. I'm just being transparent. And that's not transparent. That's just mean.
Yeah.
And it's not actually useful. But you could, if you want to be transparent, you could say, I'm struggling with the way we're working together, and I want to let you know what I'm having a hard time with, and I want to discuss it with you and see if we can, if I could do something differently, and if you're interested in doing something differently so we can work more effectively together. That's transparent, and it's true. So, you do it in a way, in my view, in which people can hear your message, and that's when transparency is really useful.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it aligns with something that Adam Grant said on this show a little while ago about radical transparency, whereby it has to be related in some way. It can't just be me saying, oh, I don't like your jacket, because then I'm just being a jerk. And it has absolutely nothing to do with the organization, the outcomes we're striving towards, and why we would introduce a culture that supports radical transparency. And it needs to be ultimately coming from a place where we realize we're dealing with a human being, not a machine.
Exactly. And, even if it is related, even if it's not about the jacket, even if it is related, I think we still need to have the skill and care to do it in a way that is, more likely to bring us a positive outcome.
Yep.
As opposed to hide behind the idea of radical transparency.
Definitely. So, Peter, I mean, the nature of our organizations is shifting, and leadership isn't so much about just having that position in the hierarchy anymore. Ultimately, it's a state of mind. It's how we show up. It's how we behave on a day-to-day basis, regardless of what title we have on our business cards. And a lot of organizations are becoming a little bit more flatter than they once were. So I guess, how does someone without the official authority develop the courage to speak up when others remain silent?
So it's interesting. I mean, I feel like I'm harping on the skill thing more than I usually do, but it seems to be coming up a lot. which is the first is you really need the skill. Like, especially if you're trying to communicate with personal power and not positional power, then, you need the skill to be able to do that. You need the skill to be able to communicate effectively without offending people, without arrogance, without the sort of better than perspective.
Yeah.
And I think part of that skill is valuing what they are bringing and advocating for what you're bringing, right? So if you want to, I'm going to exaggerate here, but if you're going to talk to your boss and you say, and again, exaggerating, but some version of, you're an idiot, you're too far away from this work, you don't understand what's going on.
Yeah.
So I'm really close to the work. So stop yapping and talking and taking up airspace and listen to what I'm saying, right? I would say that's a fairly unskilled way of speaking, up the hierarchy if you want to be heard, right? And by the way...
So I should stop doing that, Peter?
Yeah, I think it's probably a good idea. But by the way, there's all sorts of ways, there's also some more subtle ways we do exactly that same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't have to use those words, but we're still, with a look of disgust or with a look of superiority, we could basically communicate that same thing. And that's where I think it's like really behooves us to have a different kind of skill, right? And to be able to say, to appreciate what the leader is bringing or what your boss is bringing, and to explain and back up where your perspective is coming from and the legitimacy of it, and then be able to engage in a conversation that shares what you know in a way that it can be heard.
Yeah, and again, that I draw parallels between what you said there and what Annie Duke said on this show a little while ago. She was a former World Series of Poker champion and now decision-making strategist. And what she said is, if you want to come across as confident and you're trying to influence people, rather than saying I have all the answers, say I'm about 70% confident because I've done A, B, C, D, E, F, G work. Here are the results of my work. I'm unsure on this. What do you think? And that way you're projecting a sense of confidence to people and a sense of self-confidence, I suppose. And I imagine that taking that approach and bringing actual information, actual data to people who are perhaps higher up the food chain, you can then influence them. Whereas it's much harder to do that if you haven't done the work, if you're not confident in your view because you've got no data to back it up. I imagine it's much easier to do that when you've actually done some form of work.
Yeah. So you're talking about Annie Duke.
Yes.
I just had her on my show too.
Oh, great.
I love Annie. I think she's awesome.
Yeah.
And I agree with her 100%. I think she really brings a beautiful way of thinking about this. And I think, she does really great work around it. And I think she's right. Like, I'm 70% and here's why.
Definitely. So, a lot of our listeners are operating in positions whereby they're having to navigate what is an increasingly volatile, uncertain business landscape. Technology is changing at a much faster rate than what it was, say, even 10 years ago. But the only way to solve impossible challenges is ultimately through experimentation. And experimentation isn't something that has been heralded for long in large organizations. It's always been about certainty, about voracious planning, and only making a decision once we have all of the answers. But today, we're unlikely to have all of the answers. But the thing about experimentation is it's often blocked by fear in large companies based on our legacy, culture, and the way we've approached problems in the past, which ultimately aligns with something you said in a HBR article recently. You penned some insights on leading whilst feeling afraid, and you suggested that we should focus on the process instead of just the outcome. I'd love for you to unpack that for our listeners.
Yeah, actually, in some ways, I'll invoke Annie Duke again because she talks about this in a really lovely way, which is whether or the quality of your decision is not determined by whether it worked out or not, right? And that how you act is, in the long term, over time, will have a huge impact. Whether it works in a particular situation or not is not always guaranteed. So, the process of how you go about doing something, making a decision, having a conversation, showing up with integrity, it'll over time, it'll work. In that particular instance, you can't necessarily judge whether the new behavior is working based on a particular outcome. And the other piece is, it's leading while being afraid. This is an emotional courage piece. I had an interesting conversation with someone. I've been trying to write fiction, and I've been having a hard time writing it. And somebody said to me, I've written 4 books and hundreds of articles, so I'm not afraid of being at my computer and typing words. But there's something that's stopping me. And this friend of mine said, what do you think's stopping you? And I said, I think I might be afraid. Like, I know I'm a good nonfiction writer, but I think I'm actually a pretty terrible fiction writer. And I think I'm just, honestly, I think I'm just sort of scared I'm going to write, and it's like none of it's good. And she laughed and she said, oh, so you think you're supposed to be able to write without being scared? And it's like, she used my own medicine against me, or for me, but it's so poignant and so true. It's like, don't wait to feel like everything's right in order to do the hard stuff. Recognize that doing the hard stuff means things won't feel great, but you still do it. And that's how things eventually feel better.
Yeah, well, it's like Zig Ziglar used to say, anything worth doing is worth doing poorly until you can do it well. And I guess with something like getting into fiction writing, Peter, I mean, obviously you're an accomplished nonfiction writer. So perhaps, would you say that ego plays a role in preventing people from trying things outside of their comfort zone, because it may have them questioning their identity? Because obviously in your case, you've built up a profile as an author, as a leadership coach, as someone who is, quite reputable and accomplished in that space. But to venture into the world of fiction and to not be good at it, then you start to question your identity. I mean, what role do you think that plays in people ultimately silencing themselves?
I think it's a very interesting question. Like I sometimes I think if I had a bigger ego, it would be easier for me to write, because I would just say, whatever I write will be great.
Yep.
And how could I write something not great? And that maybe my ego is not big enough, to be able to write when I don't think it's going to be good. But I can also see how you're looking at it, which is to say, if you didn't have such a big ego, you could write something that's not good and it wouldn't be a problem.
Yeah.
So, I think both are really valid. And I think that I don't know what it is exactly. And I'm not sure how important it is to figure that piece out. But I do think that we have to be willing to care more about the activities we're doing than about the particular outcome, in order to get good enough about it to have a good outcome. So if I care more about the outcome of my writing than actually the process of my writing, I'll never get to the process of my writing, because at the beginning, my writing is going to be bad. Everybody's writing is bad at the beginning.
Oh, yeah.
Like, that's the nature of learning. And so if I care more about the outcome than the process, then I'll never start the process, because I'll never be happy with what I write. But if I care more about the process, and I say, I'm just going to keep at this thing, and I'm going to keep learning, and I'm going to keep trying to get better, no matter the outcome, eventually the outcome will be great.
Yeah. And it's about, I guess, reframing your definition of success as well. I mean, if you're going into it saying, I want to write a New York Times bestseller, and this is my first book and I've never written fiction before, and 12 months in, you're still, 20,000 words in and you're hating every word of it, obviously you're going to feel really poorly. But if you have different types of indicators, then it will keep you on the right path. For example, within large organizations, when it comes to innovation, a lot of the times if a company is experimenting with a new product and after 3 months it's been rolled out and it hasn't helped them grow, say, revenue by 5%, it gets canned. But as we know, with a lot of early stage startups who've gone on to, Series B, Series C rounds and become multi-$100 million companies, it took them years to get to that point, years of recording losses. So if you're going into it expecting to build a profitable business within, say, 3 months to a year, but you're doing something completely new that's never been done before, you need to reframe what success looks like. And perhaps it's having people sign up to that product and that you're seeing month on month more people signing up. But perhaps it's not so much hitting those revenue targets that the company is striving for.
Yeah, and I mean, you used the examples early on of Amazon and Tesla, and you can think of a million examples. The challenge, of course, is there's a million examples of companies that lost money and just kept losing money. And there's that old joke of like, I lose $1 on every sale, but I'm sure I'm going to make it up in volume.
Yeah.
And, like if you're going to really lose on every sale, then you're never going to, you're just going to lose more on volume. Yeah. So I think there's a discrimination in discernment in understanding and actually some projections and forward planning. Am I losing, am I getting better every day? Mm-hmm. And if you're getting better every day, then losses in the beginning are par for the course. But if you're not getting better every day, then, or every week or every month, if you're not getting better, then ultimately the losses become a problem. So, it's okay to stomach losses or struggles or, failures in the context of learning. But if it's not in the context of learning, I often say failures of effort, mm-hmm. meaning failing because think about lifting a heavy weight. And you've lifted such a heavy weight that you could no longer lift it. You've lifted to failure. Those are failures that come from effort. And that's great, right? Those are the failures that allow your muscles to grow. Yeah. But if you fail for lack of effort, that is terrible because those are the ones that don't stimulate your muscles to grow.
Yeah, very, very well put. And I guess it's about navigating that delicate balance between staying the course and deluding yourself. If you are trying to pursue some creative art, whether it's writing or whether it's trying to make it as a musician or an athlete or an entrepreneur even, at some point you might just be throwing good money after bad and something becomes a sunk cost, or you might just need to be just experimenting a little bit more, tweaking a little bit more, just keep pushing and eventually you'll break through. So, I mean, what advice do you have for people who are trying to navigate that delicate balance between deluding themselves and staying the course?
Ask yourself, do I really care? Mm-hmm. Do I care about getting good at this? Is this important to me? Do I want to focus my time and energy? Am I willing to do this through the losses in order to get to the gains? Do I have a solid chance of moving from a loss line to a gain? Those are the kinds of questions. Am I willing? I learned how to do a handstand. How did I learn how to do a handstand? Because I, every single day, tried to do a handstand for 6 months. Mm-hmm. And then one day I was able to do it. Now, if all I cared about was doing a handstand, then I never would have done that. But what I cared about was trying to do a handstand. If anything that you want to get really good at, you have to enjoy trying to get good at and actually failing and not being good at. The reason that I've never really learned to play guitar, even though conceptually I would really like to, is because I really don't like playing guitar badly. And so I can't get through that period of time of playing guitar badly to the point where suddenly I play guitar well. I always give up some point in there. Yeah. And, that's because I obviously don't want it badly enough and I don't care deeply enough to get to a place where I'm really good. So ask yourself the question, how much do you care? How committed are you? How willing are you to sit in the discomfort of poor performance to get to the point where suddenly you're doing a handstand?
Yeah, very well said. And it's easy for people, particularly people who are, say, ambitious and always driving forward, to take something up and then to just not allow themselves to give up, because then they feel like they're quitters. But ultimately it comes down to, how much do I really care? Because you can only do so many things at any given time. And, one of the biggest things that go amiss is in the execution of any strategy, as you've put it in your book, is the inability to focus on the important things. So just like in life, whether it's learning to do a handstand or learning how to surf, in business, as Peter Drucker put it, nothing is worse than the wrong things done right. So I'd love for you, with the time we have left, to unpack your big arrow model, just so our audience has a little bit more insight insofar as deciding on what to work on.
So the first thing that you need to ask. And this is what we do before we go into any, or when we go into any organization. The first thing we do is to say, what is the most important thing for you to achieve over the next 12 months? Mm-hmm. Getting super clear. Look, what we see in organizations is a lot of very productive individuals. I don't tend to go into organizations and see a lot of disengaged people. I tend to see engaged people and a lot of, hardworking, productive people who are getting traction on what they care about, but not moving the organization forward. And why is that? It's because all of them are working independently of each other, not in alignment, not collectively working on anything. And there's a few things they're working on collectively, but for the most part, they're individually productive and collectively not productive. So they can be productive, but the organization itself isn't moving forward. So the first thing we do is we look at and we identify what we call the big arrow, which is what is the most important thing for us to achieve over the next 12 months. Mm-hmm. And that will clearly set the stage. It's not everything that everyone's focused on, but if everybody's focused on 20 different things, this is the one thing that everybody collectively is focused on. And then you need to get support and use it as a filter and think about what you will do and what you won't do in order to make sure that, in the midst of everything else that happens, this is the one thing happens. And it ends up becoming a filter, which is incredibly important for the organization and for people to collaborate because, they know and you can articulate, here's what's most important for all of us to achieve. And here is my individual key contribution to making this happen. And then I can look at my strengths and my weaknesses in relation to that key contribution. And then I can get support and we can put resources towards making sure this one thing happens. And this one thing should be the first domino that knocks all the other strategic dominoes down. So it's like, you want to put a lot of thought into what that thing is, and then you want to track it and you want to measure it and you want to work towards it and you want to communicate about it. And the big arrow becomes the centerpiece of what the organization is focused on.
Perfect. I'll add a link to the big arrow model in the show notes for our listeners. Peter, with the 2 minutes we have left, I would love to just unpack how you approach your days to get the most out of them. Because in the last few years, you've published 4 books. You run Bregman Partners. You've got your own podcast called Bregman Leadership Podcast. So I'll add a link to that in the show notes for our listeners as well. What rituals or routines do you have to keep you performing at a high level?
I think like everybody, I struggle with this. I've written a book about managing time, 18 minutes, and I still struggle with it because it's hard in this age of distraction to get the most important stuff done. But I would say that I really try to protect some of my time. I try to protect my writing time so that I can really sit and write. I really love writing, and so I kind of protect that time. Mm-hmm. And I really have a filter. I think it's as important for me to know how to say no to things as it is to say yes to things. And so, I'm very aware of what I'm going to say no to, and that takes emotional courage. When someone you like asks you to do something, if you're going to say no to it, it feels like you're threatening the relationship. So you have to be very, very thoughtful about that. But I would say it's hard. There's so many amazing things to do, and to balance time with family and to balance personal time and to balance the work time and to make sure that you have a good team around you that's doing, good work. And I would just say, don't beat yourself up because it's hard. It's very hard. And I don't know that I have any secret magic to it. I know that the processes I talk about in my book, 18 Minutes, really helps because it's ways of creating an environment that makes it more likely that I'll do the things I want to do and less likely that I'll do the things I don't want to do. And that, has to do with creating the kinds of to-do lists that can be a filter for what you should say yes to and what you should say no to.
Beautifully said. Well, thank you so much for your time, Peter. You've left our audience with a lot of value bombs on the art of leadership. People can pick up a copy of Leading with Emotional Courage on Amazon, along with your other books. They can find out more about your business, Bregman Partners, at bregmanpartners.com. They can read your articles over at HBR and Forbes. They can check out your podcast, the Bregman Leadership Podcast, wherever they listen to podcasts, and they can hit you up on Twitter at Peter Bregman. Have I covered all the bases?
You sure have. That was excellent. Very well done. Better than I could have done it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Peter. Any parting words of wisdom for our listeners?
No, Steve, keep doing what you're doing. I feel like it's You ask great questions, and you're bringing, important stuff with all of your guests to your listeners. So thank you for having me on the show.
Hi guys, Steve again. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to receive a weekly email from me, complete with reflections, books I've been reading, words of wisdom, and access to blogs, ebooks, and more that I'm publishing on a regular basis, just leave your details at futuresquared.xyz/subscribe and you'll receive the very next one. If you're picking up what I'm putting down, take a minute to like, share, or subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. It goes a long way to giving the podcast the exposure it needs so I can continue bringing you guests and conversations of the highest caliber. You can catch me on Twitter at Steve Glibeski and on Instagram at TheSteveGlibeski. Until next time.
Hasta la vista, baby.